Well, it's not often I get a chance to just sit and talk about my own adoption, even though I work for Adoption UK. It's not something actually that I don't think throughout my life I've never really spent a lot of time talking about it, and I think that might be quite typical because often there's not people listening who would get it, or perhaps, well, I guess they'd be interested, but they wouldn't necessarily get it. And I think that might be one of the kind of features of adopted people. They don't, either they talk non-stop about it or they don't talk about it at all, in my experience. Anyway, I get to talk tonight. So this is my birth name, Annette Dyer, born on 13th of September 1958. And I'm an adopted parent myself. And I'm very aware really that we don't actually know an awful lot about what works, what's good practice, what makes the best results in terms of that adoption journey, the story, the life journey work, whether you have contact or no contact or some kind of contact. It's all a bit of an experiment. So this is how it worked for me. So I was born in the hospital of the army camp in Catterick in Yorkshire. I was illegitimate, as they used to say in those days. So my mother was married. She'd had a previous child, but not to my father. I was in the hospital with my birth mother until I was 10 days old, and that was fairly typical in those days. And then went to a foster placement until I was 6 weeks old. And then this bit I've highlighted because this is the bit that when I think about it, this is the bit that I have little pictures in my mind about, because my parents told me about this part quite regularly. So I was adopted from another county, which was quite unusual. And they had been a previous child who they might have had, but they didn't get because there was some kind of family connection they suddenly discovered at the last minute. So then they suggested this other child who was down a couple of hours down the motorway. And Mum used to tell me how they drove down the motorway and picked me up. And when they got to the adoption agency where I was, some woman just handed me to Mum and said, "Here, I'll give her a bottle." And Mum was absolutely terrified and shaking, but she did, obviously. Gave me a bottle, and I apparently snuggled in and relaxed in her arms, and she thought, oh, this is going to be all right, because she'd obviously been incredibly nervous. And that, telling that story, I think it feels like a really important anchor point. And I think those very early stories, whatever they are, you know, if it's your birth children, then you'll have the birth stories. If it's adopted children, then there'll always be that what was the first meeting like story, what were the little things that happened. So after that, apparently I fell asleep. They put me in the cot on the back seat of the car, which you were allowed to do in those days. Possibly not even strapped in, I don't know. I don't think they had many seatbelts in the back in those days. and drove home. And that was the beginning of my life with them. And I lived with them until I was old enough to go to university. And I had a really happy childhood. Get rid of that. I had a really great childhood, really good relationships with my parents, and it was clear they absolutely adored me. When I was about 13, it was just like a switch went on in my head. And from that point on, I was really, really determined that I wanted to meet my birth mother again. I wanted to know what she looked like. I wanted to hear her story. I wanted to hear what her voice was like. I was quite obsessed about it from that point on. And when I was 21, I did manage to meet her. And I'll tell you a little bit about that journey. Stopped clicking. Why is that? Okay, so as I said, I did have a very happy childhood, and it wasn't that unusual to be adopted in those days. So there were about 21,000 adoptions a year, I think. I remember that figure back then, and there's only about 5,000 a year now. So it was much more common to be adopted. This is me with my dad, and then me with my mum. I went to a really good school, had a very structured, safe, secure upbringing, clearly massively loved. I think I was given that sense that I could achieve anything, that I'd probably go to university, that I would do well and get a good job. Those were all kind of givens that I just took on and didn't think about. And as I say, it wasn't that unusual to be adopted. And in actual fact, my cousin was adopted too. So that's the two of us sitting there, me with a bow in my hair. For some reason, Mum was obsessed by putting bows in my hair. in every single photograph. I've got a bow in there. My cousin was Liz. She's 18 months older than me, and she got to wear much nicer clothes. I was always really jealous of her tartan trousers. I was in these horrible dresses. Anyway, here we are, 2 adopted children. So this is my mum's sister. She'd adopted a little girl. They'd had 2 birth children, and then she'd adopted Liz, and then me. And we spent a lot of our childhood together. And I don't think we ever talked about our adoption. I don't remember ever talking about it. It wasn't that it was a secret. It was just, it wasn't one of those things that was talked about somehow. Mm. So they never hid the fact that they adopted me. I remember Mum told me when I was really young, right from in that she said she used to tell me when I was in the bath and she was bathing me, and she'd say, "Mummy and Daddy's adopted daughter, and Mummy and Daddy love Anne." And it was that little sort of rhyme that was just a way of getting that adoption word in quickly. And she told me about when they picked me up, and that, you know, was mentioned from time to time. But actually the reasons that led to my adoption, I did get what they knew, but they didn't know very much. There was no such things as life storybooks, or there was nothing very much. There was just what my parents had been told at the point when I was adopted, and Mum would tell me what she knew, and in fact it turned out some of that was wrong. I think she'd forgotten it over the years, or, you know, maybe she only heard it once and it didn't really stick. And my dad never talked about that part of the adoption until I was about 16, when he very briefly slid across the table my adoption papers and then took it back and put them in a safe place. And I pretended I wasn't that bothered, but actually I was absolutely mind blown, because I'd seen the name of my birth mother for the first time. But I didn't let on, or at least I tried not to let on. And I think he thought I just wasn't interested, but I was. So there was no assumption in those days that there would be any kind of reunion. And it was just assumed that that was it. Adoption order granted, new family, that was it. You were never going to meet again. But when I was a teenager, the law changed. There was a lot of campaigning by adopted adults, and I remember hearing it on the radio. I can remember standing at the kitchen bench in my parents' house and hearing all these conversations on the radio about why it was so important that adopted adults should be able to get their birth records or make contact with their birth family. And as a result of that, the government finally set up a register so that adopted children, adults, and they could put their name on the register, and their birth parents could put their name on the register. And if the 2 lots of names were there, then they would facilitate a contact between them. But that was the first sort of glimpse that things were going to be different for us, and that it was be different to what my parents had imagined. But they never asked. They never said, "Would you like to do this?" or "We'll support you to do this." I think they thought that I would say something to them, and I just couldn't quite bring myself to do it, because I could sense that there was a lot of emotion around that. And obviously anything that had happened to my birth parents after my birth, my own parents had no knowledge of that at all. So there was no kind of ongoing understanding of what was happening with my family, my birth family. So as I say, at 13, I decided that I really wanted to know what my birth mother looked like, but I couldn't do anything about it and didn't discuss it. And when I was 18, I went to university, and it's dawned on me that that meant that I could actually start some kind of searching. I could get letters without my parents knowing about them, so I could do that without involving them. And it was really strange, because the first week that I was at university, I went into this big bookshop, the university bookshop. I went to the university in Liverpool, and it's a bit like they do in W.H. Smith sometimes, tables piled high with books all over. Went in the door, and there was this book. I swear it was right at the front of the first table. And I can't remember the exact title, but it was basically How to Find Your Birth Family. Really bizarre. I couldn't quite believe that I picked it up. I did. I picked it up, bought it, took it back and started. It was just you know, this is how you do it. This is step by step how to do it. And so I made a start. So I got in touch with social services. I think first of all, you had to get in touch with your local social services. They had to vet you and see whether you were sane enough to be able to be given your birth records. I don't think they actually used that term, but that was how I interpreted it, and I thought it was a bit of a cheek, really. But I did it. And the search continued, and it took years and years and years. Well, no, it didn't take years. It took a whole year. It felt like years, but it took a whole year to get there. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Communication was very slow in those days, of course. This was before the days of emails, so everything had to be written, handwritten in this case, in letters. So this was one of several letters from the social worker to me, telling me about the next step and what I should do next, and here's the address I should write to, and write it, send it, wait for a week or so for something to come back. So things were much slower, and I actually think that was really useful. I think it gave me time to kind of process each piece of information as it came. So I never did get my whole set of records at that point. I finally got my birth certificate, my original birth certificate. So that had my birth mother's name on and the address and her age and her date of birth. And then I used that to follow back and then to follow forward through birth records, marriage records, death records. And that meant that I spent quite a lot of time in London at the General Register office, Somerset House. I don't think this is actually a picture of that, but it's the nearest I can get. But it was basically rows and rows and rows and rows of these enormous books. So there were red ones for births and green ones for marriages and black ones for deaths. And I think there was 4 for every year, or maybe it was more than that. Anyway, it just took forever. You had to climb, get these huge things down, stick them on a desk, leaf through, find the next one. And by doing that, I did find that I had 2 younger siblings. Actually, I had 3, but one of them being born abroad, so I didn't pick that one up till later. But I thought 2. And for each of those births, there was a new address, so I would write to that address. And finally, I got an answer from one of these dozens and dozens of letters that I sent out. The language in those days in these things was a bit bizarre. So this is from my adoption papers, and this is how they described it. I just think it's quite interesting. And when this is all you've got, you don't really have much more of a picture. You kind of hang on all these words. So this bit about their marriage might have a better chance of success if the illegitimate child was placed for adoption, I thought was a little blunt. Maybe they do the same as today, I don't know. Anyway, I did finally make contact, and I finally met her. And this is, I think, either the first night or the second night when I got to know her. We clearly had a few drinks. We were trying to relax. So I was in a student flat in Liverpool. That's what the background is. And they came up from Cornwall where they were living. So that's my birth mother sitting next to me. And my youngest sister, Andrea, on one end. My birth mother's husband, Marcus Dyer, the army guy who she'd broken up with, got pregnant, gone back to, and as it turned out, had broken up with again later on, but had gone back to. So he was still very much her husband and still very much living with her and still very much dominating the whole family. So actually all I had really been focused on was meeting my birth mother, but suddenly I was in this big roiling family and I'd been grown up as an only child. So it was quite a shock to the system. And it wasn't really what I wanted. That wasn't what I planned. It wasn't what I'd kind of gone out to find. And I think that's, not unusual either. Once you make that step, you don't really know what you're going to get into. But I did finally get some answers. So this is a photograph. I think she was pregnant with me, or she was just about to get pregnant with me. It was just before they broke up, I think. So this is the young Patricia, Pat Dyer, and her handsome husband, who happens to be from Neath in Wales, which is actually just about 10 miles from where I live now. It's a purely out of coincidence, but strange how we all end up together. And at that point, from that point on, I ceased to be this only child. Well, part of me was still an only child because that's how I'd been brought up. But now I was the second of 5 siblings. So the picture on the right when I'm looking at it, the 2 younger people, that's the young me and my little sister, Andrea. That was the first time I'd ever experienced being a big sister. She was used to having big sisters, but I wasn't used to having any sisters. And then I got to know the other ones. So I've got an older sister, Helen. There's Helen, then me, then Stephen, then Leslie, then Andrea. So 5 of us all together. And as it says there, I was the only one of them that went to university or even did an A-level or own my own house. So I grew up with a very different lifestyle to the way that they grew up. And I think that's something that for me is quite important about adoption, and quite important, I think, for adoptive parents to understand that more often than not, your adopted child, as they're trying to make sense of their birth family and their adoptive family, will not only be trying to make sense of that, but they're also trying to straddle these 2 very different worlds and massive inequality and all of that means. I mean, actually, my siblings are at least as bright as me, if not brighter. I think, you know, if we all sit down and chat, they've actually got much sharper brains in many ways than me. I think they could have done fantastically well if they'd gone to university. You know, they could have ended up with really good jobs, but that expectation wasn't there, and the kind of support that they needed for that wasn't there, and that's why that didn't happen for them. So what was that whole journey like? I just sort of chucked down a bunch of words, really, because I think that kind of sums it up for me. So it was very emotional. It's been very confusing at times, trying to work out where do I fit in these 2 different worlds, and which parts of me come from which different parts of the world. You know, do I really have all these sisters? Do I not have these sisters? What does all that mean? Very happy. I'm really, really happy that I grew up in the household that I grew up in, and that I have met my birth mother, and we get on really well. In fact, I get on really well with the whole family now. It took a while to sort of settle into it. As I say, it didn't really make me see inequality in a way which I think I wouldn't have seen probably otherwise. I did feel quite jealous, because I wanted my birth mother's attention, and all of those other things were going on in her life, so I couldn't really have it in the way that I'd wanted. Not at that time. I have since, but at the time when I wanted it, it wasn't really available. As I say, confusing. It's definitely confusing, and very exciting as well. The whole journey's been really exciting. I wouldn't have missed it. It's been amazing, and I think it's taught me a lot about life. So what now then? Well, I think I'm now pretty much at ease with who I am. I think it's taken a long time. I like to kind of imagine it as being like a woven piece of cloth. So there's the biology, the nature part, the genetics, and then the nurture part, and they kind of all intertwine. And actually, I think our job as adopted people is to try to weave those different threads together and come out with something that's a coherent and happy and healthy whole. And that is quite a long journey, and it takes time. I still haven't decided whether to look for my birth father and his family. I mean, it is getting on a bit now. If I'm going to, I should probably get on with it. But there is that thing about once you open that Pandora's box, you don't quite know what you're going to find in there. It's hard to put the lid on it again. I never told my parents what I was doing, and I did the whole thing separately from them, and I regret that that wasn't possible to share that. Mum died without knowing that I'd ever found my birth parents, and when my dad was dying, he'd literally been told he only had a few days to live. He had a heart attack, and it was only then that he said, "Did you ever do anything about finding your birth family?" And I had this like split second to decide what I was going to do, and I told him that I had, and he was really relieved because he was worried about leaving me alone in the world, and so it was really reassuring to him to know that there was someone else out there who would look after me or be a kind of parent to me when he couldn't be. But I really regret that I wasn't able to do that much earlier, and I think that probably there are some things about if my parents had felt more able to keep that conversation open, not just the conversation about being adopted, but the conversation about at some point I might want to make contact, I might be curious, and that they would be happy to be alongside me in that, then I would have felt more able to talk about it, and we could have done it together. and I think that would have been good. I think it did. It made a little bit of a distance between me and them. I'm really glad that we didn't have Facebook or even email in my day, because I think that thing of taking it slowly was really important. And I feel worried about kids these days who suddenly get bombarded by birth family stuff on their Facebook feed. And we know from the adoption barometer that that is happening to a lot of young people now. And I think that's tough on them. I think it should really be the adopted person having control over that process. And I am just about to start the whole thing over again with my own son, who's 13 and adopted. Well, maybe I am. Maybe you'll never want to know. And when I try to, without bombarding him, I do try to have that conversation from time to time. I drop his birth mother's name into the conversation. On his birthday, I'll say, oh, I wonder what Dorothy's thinking today, just to try and keep that conversation open and make it really clear that if he wants to meet her, then we'll organise that, we'll be with him. If he doesn't, that's fine as well. It's entirely his choice. I think that's it. Oh, no. One more slide, I've forgotten. Okay, so what have I learned from this? So I think it's really, really important that as adoptive parents, we tell the truth in an age-appropriate way from the start. And Helen Oakwaters got some brilliant video about that, about how you might do it. She thinks about it as sort of big pieces of jigsaw at the beginning, sort of just big general facts, and then as they get older, more nuanced facts. It's like having smaller, more detailed bits of the jigsaw to fill in. One thing that a CAMS psychiatrist said to me one day as part of working in Adoption UK that's really stuck with me and made a really big impression was that having a coherent life narrative is essential to good mental health. So even if you have a really, really hard story to get your head around, the fact that it is a story and it leads, one bit leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next, and makes some kind of sense is absolutely essential for all of us. We all need to understand our story. So that story about, mum feeding me with a bottle when she first met me, that's a really, really important stepping stone in my coherent life narrative. And it's taken a while, but I've been able to fill in some of the gaps in it. And I think the more that we can help our children develop that, the better for their mental health. And I don't think that life journey books on their own are very much help with that. I mean, obviously they're a piece of it, but it always makes me nervous when I hear adoptive parents saying, oh, well, I always leave their life journey book out and they can have a look at it. And I think you need more than that. You need to be able to talk comfortably with them. I think even if it's a really hard story, I think what we can do as adoptive parents is to find ways to share that narrative, to make sense of that narrative and share it with our children, because then that'll help them make sense of it. And actually we can only do that if we look after our own emotional health and learn to regulate and manage our own emotions. So we need to be able to work through our own emotions about our anger or whatever might have happened to our adopted children. And we need to work through that on our own, so that when we're with our children, we can be really regulated with our own emotions, and we can help them to have their emotions. So we shouldn't be expecting our kids to manage our emotions. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And I think on some level that's what I felt I would have to do with my mother. If I was going to do that journey with her, she would have all of her emotions out there and I'd have to deal with them, and I couldn't really manage that. And I think that's part of why I kept it separate. So that's what I've learned. I hope some of it's useful, and I'm happy to answer questions later on. Stop sharing now.
That was so brilliant. I remember when we did this, when the last time we did a webinar, and I think I went first, and I remember you mentioning, did we have a chat beforehand? But there's so many elements there that I kept nodding, and I kind of thought I'd stop nodding too much, because I can relate to so much to what you're sharing. Right, and now I'm going to do the tricky bit of trying to share my screen. Hang on. Here we go. So I think, is this going to work? Let's find out. Is that sharing okay?
Yeah, we can see you, that's fine.
Brilliant. Genuinely, listening to your journey, Anne, is amazing, and I say it touched it just opened so many things for me, and as part of preparing for tonight, and just as a brief introduction then, so I'm Anne's, I've been volunteering now with Adoption UK Wales for 3 years. I couldn't get over that when I thought about it the other day. But also I've been a host, so I kind of run a monthly adult adoptee group as well, which meet up online monthly. And similarly for this, very rarely would I take an opportunity to share my own personal journey, because like Alma, it's not something that I do openly. And also, as you kind of see, as I'll share my journey, I think it's because sometimes I'm worried about hurting people, because I never want to hurt anybody. But anyhow, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Here we go. So first of all, let me introduce you. You may not recognise this baby, but this is me, Nicola Cox. And I was born in Cardiff in 1971. And this photograph has an awful lot of meaning, and you'll see how this works through my journey. I met my foster parents in 1971, and I was also formally adopted into a loving family in Swansea Valley, and that's when I became Anwen Davis. There's been no secret about my adoption. I've always known that I was adopted. One of my earliest memories is a story when I was very little about a fox cub getting lost in the woods and got stray away from his family. So a family of bears came nearby, and they brought the cub in and raised the cub as their own, and that was my first gentle introduction about being adopted. But it kind of logically, it all kind of made sense. And I also had a really happy childhood. There was never any question about feeling different, you know, in my early years. And you know, to that way of openness of always knowing that, you know, I had foster parents. I actually grew up knowing my foster parents. They came to my wedding. We'd quite often go over to Barry to go and see them for a cup of tea now and again, particularly my teenage years when I was going through some of my tricky moments, I'd say. And today I'm married. We've got 5 grown-up children, 3 grandchildren, 2 of which were born in lockdown and has home births. That was an interesting one. But we're also in reunion with my wider birth family. So I kind of like to say we've got a family forest. Growing up, there weren't any secrets. And actually, I thought I'd put this bit here, that my parents were wonderful, and they still are. My dad always used to say to me growing up, well, you know, have faith in that vision, you know, and in whatever I do, believe in yourself and have faith in the vision. But what I thought was that also at the age of about 12, 13 for me, that's what the earliest recall I can get about, I needed to know more. You know, it was that bit of almost, I was really chomping at the bit. I wanted to know more about me. And so then I started thinking, well, actually, if you were to ask me as an adoptee, why do you want to find your birth family? Because I know I've spoken and met plenty of other colleagues of mine who, you know, over the years that have been, that were adopted, and they'd be quite adamant. I have no intention, I have no interest whatsoever. So then I thought, well, why am I different then? So I was just wondering, well, is it because I'm curious? You know, does that bit of curiosity? Is it because I really, really, really want to know about my identity? Is it because from day one there was always that openness and transparency that, you know, that my natural kind of me is I was adopted, that's who I am? And in a way, I kind of think it's all of the above. But everything links to, and I'll kind of just hold it up, but it's my brown envelope. And my brown envelope, so I should say, so my dad was also, he taught in school, he was a carpenter, and he built a bureau at home. And I remember that in the secret drawer of the bureau, if I opened that, this is where this would live. This is where my little brown envelope would be. And this actually goes back to 1969. So to me, this is the beginning of my journey. This is kind of my touchstone, my anchor point as to when my story began, because that's when my parents' story began. And actually looking through the comms back then about their registration for adoption, adopted a child in 1969. And then all of a sudden getting all the little clues about the identity. When I read back to 1971, and I think it's at that point, whilst I always knew I was adopted, what I would say is at this point, when I turned to about 13, 14, I don't really remember sitting down openly with my parents, maybe once, but then I saw the envelope being put away. And then when nobody was around, I'd go to that secret, or at least I thought nobody around. Of course they would have known, because they wouldn't necessarily push it back in the right way, or I heard them coming through the front door, and it's silly really. I think back then why I didn't share with them about my curiosity, why I didn't share with them that I was really eager and keen to try and find out more about my birth parents, but I didn't want to hurt them. I just, because I couldn't understand things myself. It wasn't all absorbing when I was growing up. Don't get me wrong. In my teenage years, I did things like going to the rugby club, and I've got a diary from 1986 that I often kind of reflect back on, which is quite comical. There's nothing in there about my adoption, but I do remember going down there and snogging Martin, rugby club, all normal teenage stuff. But I would say it's that thing I query now, why didn't I mention anything to mum and dad? But I think all those little clues and that curiosity, that wanting to know about my identity, I think that almost were my early bits of training of becoming a detective. This bit here that I've kind of put up, that kind of screen grab of advice to adopters, what happens next, your milk book, a medical card, that's actually in my little brown envelope, because this was what my parents had for training, about when you bring your baby home. And I do remember them often saying as well, when they first collected me, as you say, Nan, that anchor point, to me, it was driving back on the M4 down to Swansea, and then the way they described it was the little village, everybody's come and almost kind of lined the street so for this baby coming out, and my grandmother was there, she was in tears, and they said, and she would say, well, why am I crying? They said, well, that's love without seeing. So, all of these kind of sweet, lovely little anecdotes that I remember fondly about growing up. But the search bits kind of changed, I think, as I also then hit adulthood. And now I left home, now I was 18, and actually this flow chart was my learning ground on how you search, because I'd registered with NoCap, and first of all I'd registered with social services, the telephone directory, kind of leafing through that, trying to find any semblance of the surname, and driving around those streets and thinking, shall I go knock the door? And maybe not. Ringing up, actually, because I managed to think, goodness knows how many people I actually rang up randomly thinking, so are you, no, so I must have thought, person absolutely going off the rails. But with NoCap, the kind of, I'm not sure, it just explained with NoCap, is that bit of almost like a contact. It was a way of registering, and maybe your birth parents had registered there as well. It was that bit of, again, just trying to reach out and listen and learn from other people who were in the same boat, because at this point I felt really quite alone, because I knew that I desperately wanted to find information. I wanted to meet my birth mother and my birth father, but when you're reading information like consider carefully your position and that of your mother, proceed with extreme caution. Now, I know, but I used to love adventure books when I was growing up. Turn to page 50 if you want to know this. I'm thinking this is like an adventure book, but joking aside, there's so much to learn here, because it was such a difficult journey. My search took 10 years. In that process, that there were a lot of closed doors. There was a lot of kind of feeling rejected. I think, again, it brought all of those kind of emotions up. I think my advice, if for when going through the search, if I was to do it again, you know, really that there should be a way of sharing expectations, just sharing knowledge, that bit of getting facilitation, getting support, because I didn't really talk about this with my parents either. Why? And again, it's because I didn't want to hurt them, and there was that bit that almost, I don't think mum really, maybe dad, but I don't think mum ever really thought that I would search. I don't think she was prepared for it, and I certainly don't think that it was something that she thought that once I left home, because it was such a happy childhood, that maybe I was okay, you know, I didn't need to go look further. And it's interesting what you touched on as well, and about today, the social media. No, I'm talking about letters as well. I have to go and write to social services, and that took, you know, my birth records, there's actually a thing on there, 8 to 12 weeks before getting a response. That gives you time to think, you know. But now the thought of actually just immediately going on Facebook, immediately kind of having that access to, not necessarily having a considered way of thinking, am I ready to open this? Yeah, and that's where I think this sharing stories and our experiences is really important. So discovering, this actually is also is a letter like this. Factually, the child will be different, but it must not be treated differently to the natural child. It must not be spoiled. And it's down to, I think this is kind of golden, you know, I think this probably would have been written in 1969, 1970, but years of love and affection given to the child will always hold good. And that still stands today, I think. But now we're at, okay, now we're at the bit of discovering, and it's at this point the search was coming to a head, and it's at this point that I really thought, right, you know, I'm going to start disrupting and making disruptions. So, you know, am I wanting to do this? Is this a good thing to do? You know, well, there was no advice really. There is also another bit to the stoking the fire, which that was when I first told my dad that I'd found my birth father. I told it to him because I always told them before I found that information at that final step. But the first thing he did was started stoking the gas fire, and he said, "Oh, I'm fine, great," you know. So there's a two definitions of that for me. The taxi ride, I always kind of think that might be a helpful thing as well. So after going through all the formal social services, kind of going nowhere, our car broke down after going out, me and Dave, and we had a taxi driver, Bill, who brought us home and drove Dave to work the next morning. And he ended up saying to Dave, "Oh, a small chit chat. Where are you from?" Mentioned Dinas Powys. Dave explained my background story, that I couldn't find my birth mother. I'd been looking for 10 years. And he said, "Oh, I'll ask at the local tonight." Anyway, long story short, he did ring up and say, "Yeah, I think I've got a lead." And that is how I ended up knocking on a lady's door 2 weeks later. And that is how I ended up sitting in her front room after kind of telling Dave to turn the engine off of the car. And it's the first time I saw a photograph of my mother, of her husband, and their 2 children, their 2 sons. They lived in Hong Kong. So that's the point of no return to me. Previous to that, I'd mentioned I'd found my birth father as well. But I really wasn't ready for the next part. And on that next part of opening that box, what came with that? And you know, really thinking about it, we've got at least 3 or more families. I've got my parents, I've got my birth family and their tree, you know, and I've also got my birth father, and we're a really open family. That's kind of the way I am. And I kind of wanted everybody to get on. Kind of naive, but you know, in terms of the process, would I change anything about the discovery part on this journey? Oh hell yeah! If I could look at ways of doing this slightly different, yes I would, because I think a lot of people need support in this part of the process, and it really doesn't exist right now, as well as it should, in my personal opinion. So this is contact. Okay, so this is me on the left. First time I met my birth mum, she handed me this. I was 32, and this is her, and she's always held this close, and this is her. I got it, it's upstairs with me. But this is the moment that I met her, and when I did, I wasn't ready for the roller coaster of emotions. Not just for me, for my birth mum. She was 17 when she had me, and she loved me dearly. But my birth father, who I'm also really close with as well, they're not together. But she thought he was older, and then it transpired when she was pregnant with me that he was not, and the families couldn't support. And at that point, I think she was about to kind of, I think she did come over. This picture here is her holding me and my foster parents. And the person who took the photograph is the man she married and is with today. So he met me. And that's a really lovely full circle as well, because we can relate, you know, in a way I always worried as well that what if I open this box and her family don't even know I exist, because that can happen, and then she doesn't want to meet me, and all these ifs and buts come in. But she did want to meet me, and she always did love me. She never forgot my birthday. She still doesn't. And I was really, really lucky. I think I was really, really lucky that, you know, we got this connection. I wouldn't be who I am now if I hadn't been adopted, because I wouldn't be speaking Welsh. I hadn't grown up in the valleys. Probably wouldn't have met Dave. But it's that thing where, you know, that this contact point, that roller coaster of emotions, this isn't just me and my birth mum, my birth father, this is my parents. Everybody in that circle is deeply affected by that point. And it's a pivotal point, because the person in the middle is the adopted child, trying to hold everything together. At that point, for me, it was almost like understanding the unknown, because I'd made ifs and buts. I'd had imaginations, you know, kind of, I had a vivid imagination growing up. I think that's why I'm as creative in many ways as I am now. Nothing's impossible. But, you know, it's that bit that when you grow up, you have doubts that the facts that you're given in your adoptive records, actually they made that up to make you feel good, you know, and you doubt everything. But actually, when I met my birth mother and I met my birth father, I hadn't been lied to, and that was a really massive thing as well. The flashbacks, I think this is quite important, just to underline why I put that in. What I wasn't ready when you open Pandora's box is that everybody in this circle, in my experience, flashback to 1969, flashback to 1971, everybody would turn to me, whether this because there was a combination of them feeling guilty, of them feeling they needed to be defensive, of explaining their backgrounds. So they'd turn to me at the time and just offload, really, just explain. And some of it was quite deep stuff. Some of it, I remember, I wasn't ready to hear what was coming out thick and fast from different directions. And I felt like, you know, those Mr. Stretchy toys, kind of felt like I don't want to say no to anybody because I don't want to hurt anybody, but at the same time that was hard. This bit took years. There was one bit I mentioned, the christening. I did actually invite everybody. Dave and we invited everybody from a birth family, from birth parents, father, mother, my adopted, my parents. Sorry, language. But I invited everybody, and oh god, the tension in that room. We all came to a physical place with a christening, and everybody was trying to be discreet, but no, certain things, I think the waters kind of run too deep. It was just too painful. But one instance as well, when you mentioned about Facebook, and it's a note of caution, because we had a families don't always get on, and like, kind of, obviously that's a common sense thing, but with this instance it did bring up scars. And I remember there was one, not at the christening, but there was another moment where an impromptu, you know, my parents' anniversary, and I was invited, and my birth father was invited last minute, and my birth mother wasn't, because it was purely last minute. My daughter took a picture and put it on Facebook, my family. And of course, my birth mother wasn't there. We fell out, probably because she didn't say anything, but we didn't speak for months. And then we eventually just, because we weren't comfortable enough to have a row, and then it eventually came out. But yeah, Facebook can be a really kind of provoking thing. And then, yeah, so I guess, what does it mean today? So this kind of really bad diagram, because I ran out of time. It's not brilliant. But our family is, that's me and Dave, that's our 5 children, that's kind of our grandchildren. This is our family. But also our family is my parents and my birth mother and her family, and my birth father and his family. They're all separate. They're all different worlds. Trying to figure out where I fit in those worlds. It's taken, what, 18 years maybe? I still don't know if of course I still love my family too. My parents growing up, that bond is us. Yeah, we're but sometimes, since I found my birth mother, I do openly say, although not to my birth parents again, because I don't want to hurt them, but I feel like the moment I've discovered my birth mother, not so much my birth father, but my birth mother, a distance started to happen, I think, because one of the first things that Mum did was she got an album together from the moment of this, me growing up to my teenage years. She almost just said, right, you know, you can give that to you. And I went, no, you're not getting rid of me that bloody quickly. That's not happening. But today, yeah, I think there has been a change. I think there's certain things I see Dave with his kind of family, and there's bonds that, you know, you kind of get, I think, and there's that thing that I think whilst we've got bonds, and I love my birth mother and her family dearly, and she always says I belong there, and my parents say I belong there. My birth father were not quite so close, but it's that thing where it is complicated. It's really, really complicated, and it's that thing, that openness of adoption shouldn't just be about the introduction that you're adopted to me as a child. It's about that bit of going through your teenage years and having that conversation, and, you know, as you're saying, I'm dropping in the name, you know, with your son in conversation and making it feel natural. I know every kind of story is different and every background is different, but I think looking at ways of trying to kind of drip feed natural bits. I think my parents were trying to do that by introducing me to my foster parents, but it didn't quite work out, and I think that's a learning. So it's who I am. I'm adopted, love it. You know, I wouldn't be Anne's if I wasn't. But it does mean an awful lot to me, and you know, I've put down here because I think it's important. Every chapter as I grow older, the perception of adoption for me, it changes. We had quite a sad life event happen over summer, and you know, we lost a member of family who was close to me, but on my birth father's side. And you know, just the reason why I say that, I don't think anybody other than Dave could relate to how I felt, because no one else was close to that circle. These circles don't cross, and I think part of the hardest task is to try and get these to, you know, to kind of link over each other, and it may be baby steps to do that, but I think it's important. And who's really, really important on this is you adopters, really. I just think that without my parents and without them opening up to me, as I say, I wouldn't be who I am now. And it's that openness that's important, but all the way along. And the search and discovery and connect. Yeah, I say I'm so fortunate to kind of have the monthly group where we meet up with adult adoptees, and everybody's story is different. But boy, are we a tenacious bunch. The detective work from early on, I think we could run a detective agency. But I think what's really important as well is sessions like this, because if we can't share our collective knowledge and experience to help the younger, you know, generation coming up, they should avoid some of the pinch points and hurt that we felt growing up. And that's why I'm really, really grateful and privileged to be asked to share my story actually this evening. And I think that's me saying just thank you. Diolch.
Oh, thank you very much, Anne, and it's been really great to hear you speak and hear your stories and your experiences. Just a reminder to everyone that's been watching that you can ask any questions. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
My computer just like restarted temporarily, and I thought I'd been cut off completely. I stopped being able to see anything on the screen. Yeah, so you can ask questions through the Q&A button on the control panel on Zoom. We've had a couple of questions come through, which I'll ask in a moment. And also, if you've got any comments, you can pop those onto the chat as well. Thank you both for kind of sharing your stories. That's a couple of things that come through. There were some earlier comments, but because my computer just kind of rebooted itself, for some reason I've lost the earlier comments. So I do apologize, can't read those out. But if you've got any questions, please put them on now. The two questions we've got so far, the first one to both of you, I think, so you can choose which one of you answers first. But what is your advice to prospective adoptive parents about how to support finding birth families if the children want to?
I think making it clear that it's not going to upset you. I mean, you might be terrified inside about what they're going to find and how that's going to be. And I think it's reasonable to say, look, you don't know what you're going to find. And, you know, but I think you should try as much as you can to give the message that it's not going to affect the bond that you've got with your child, you know, and make that really explicit. That would be my advice.
I'd echo that 100%.
Yeah.
It's about, you know, your bond is so special, but it is underlying that bit that you're, you know, that open comes when they're ready to talk, and that's the thing where it goes back to what you were saying as well, Anne, about making it natural in terms of part of the conversation as well, and dropping in the name when you feel like it's appropriate to do so, not forcing. And I know that's easier said than done. We've actually got a brilliant couple that come sometimes to our adoptee group, and it's her mum, her adopted mum as well, and actually seeing the way their relationship is absolutely magical, because that openness and that bond that they've got to just kind of share, you know, and I think that's because that's something that they've spoken about it throughout, but you know, just naturally.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. So next question we've got was, well, they say, that was so full of insight, thank you very much. Obviously, the reasons for children being adopted tend to nowadays be very different than both of your experiences, i.e. through drugs, neglect, abuse, etc. And wondered if you could share your thoughts on how this might affect an adopted person's journey to find birth family in the circumstances they might have now.
I think it must make it harder and more complicated, but I think some of these basic principles still remain, that it's really important that we help our children to understand that story. They need to understand the story, even if it's really, really tough. That's better than having gaps and not understanding, or questions, or the story is really important, however hard it is. And I think as adopters, we probably need quite a lot of support to think about how to talk about some of that really tough stuff. And I don't think there is enough support, ongoing support at the moment, particularly, you know, when you get to those teenage years.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think there's almost a flip side for that as well, in that if you don't, you know, if in that situation, if that difficult story isn't shared early on, I've had people that I've spoken to through the group that have found out by accident when they're in their 50s, and by accident they've got hold of their birth certificate, and by accident they've discovered this myriad of information they never knew about themselves. Now they feel like their life is then a lie, and then that opens up a different conversation. And I think again it's so important, I think, that the support is there for you as adopters to share that story, because it's that thing that sometimes brushing things under the carpet, it doesn't go away. But it's how you share that in a way that kind of also makes you feel that everything is okay as well.
My partner has quite a good line that might be helpful, actually. She said to my son, look, some babies have really difficult births. They end up with having cesareans. They end up, you know, being really traumatic birth stories. And some people have really quite difficult adoption stories. and that's okay. You know, we'll get through that and we'll move on either way. So I think that's quite a useful analogy.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, next question. The person says, I'm very open, but my husband isn't. I met my daughter's birth mother and have a picture of us both. How important is it for both parents to be open?
I think it would be really helpful if he could, and it'd be interesting to try and explore a bit about why, you know, why not? What is he? Maybe he's afraid of something, or I think it's really helpful if both parents are.
Yeah.
It
And
is
kind of like, sorry, go on, Hans.
no, it's that reluctance a little bit, because I kind of that I wonder when I hear that question, I think back a little to why what is what's the concern of maybe just reaching out and finding it, and I think that sometimes is something that's worth trying to talk about as well, which again is easier said than done.
Yeah, definitely. And that previous question links into the next question, which is, how do you feel about adopters meeting birth families when the child is first placed, which is always an interesting one that comes up, isn't it? And there's different experiences for every placement. I know for my own, we were told we weren't allowed to, that it wasn't going to be an opportunity to meet our children's birth mother, although we would have loved to and would have really wanted the opportunity. So yeah, how do you feel about that?
Personally, I think in principle, I think it's really good. We did meet my son's birth mother several times and his father, and it's been really helpful because we can just throw little things into the conversation about, oh, I think you're taller than your birth mum was now, or just little things that are helpful to him. What colour eyes she had, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it's really helpful, and I think most adopters would say that it has been useful when they've done it, and it kind of what you see written on paper about somebody, and then when you see them in the flesh, they're rarely quite so awful as it sounds when you see these stuff written on paper.
And it almost feels as well, depending on I guess each circumstance is different, but if there is a way of meeting up together earlier on, then it's that thing that somehow I think you feel part of that journey. You're involved, and how I just say, I just kind of think back to that christening moment where everybody was in a room, and that would have been what, 35, 36 years since the beginning, and there's an awful big chasm there. And then if you think, well, if there's a way of just how do you gently introduce and have that facilitated meeting, yeah, I think it's a really good step, but it's obviously according to each circumstance.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a few more questions. Are you both okay for time if we just try and get through a couple more of these? Is that all right? So Facebook, Insta, Twitter, Snapchat is something that really worries this person. How have you handled that, if you've had to, or what are your thoughts on it? I know you kind of touched on it a bit, Anne.
Yeah, I think it is worrying, to be quite honest. I think all we can do is warn our kids that this might happen, and maybe think through what will we do if this happens, if somebody tries to make contact. Think through the scenario and think about what a good next step would be.
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? Because I just remember that that Facebook incident that and good God, the family ripples there. I thought at one point we're not going to speak again. On my birth mother's side, and I think for kids now, it's almost when you kind of try and teach them about the dangers of social media, just as a general, when I speak to my kids, I know the dangers of social media, but this adds a different layer, and it's almost speak about it up front. About online safety is kind of one thing, but I think there is another angle there about just sometimes awareness is better, because if you speak about it up front and say, just bring it into natural conversation, if anything does happen, they know it's okay to come to you.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's never. And our daughter's gone when she was a teenager coming up. She was kind of approached by somebody. Everything was fine, but she didn't tell us. We found out through her friend's parents, and it's that thing. I'm thinking, oh, why didn't I say anything? So there's no perfect right or wrong, but I think talking up front maybe means that they can come to you.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just having that honest two-way dialogue the whole time, isn't it? From an early age as well. Like our boys have always known that we don't let them be in, group photos at school or those kind of things, and they know that we don't put photos of them on our social media, and it's kind of trying to explain why that reason is and what the impact is without it might sound like a horror story that someone's going to come and snatch you. It's actually about saying, we're trying to keep you safe, and we're trying to make sure that you're, when the time is right and those connections might happen, because that could happen through social media, being very honest with them about it, preparing them in that way,
Absolutely.
just so they know. And also having an open phone policy, which is one of the key things that we do, is now our eldest son has got a mobile phone and stuff. Is like he knows he leaves it outside of the bedroom in the evening, and we have to have the passcode, and we'll periodically check, just to, not because we don't trust him, because we don't trust the world, kind of thing, and having those kind of conversations as well. So
yeah.
No, I think all comms is really, really good. It's as much as it can be difficult raising teens, you just got to stick to your guns sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, we've still got quite a few questions, so if we don't get through all of them, then I do apologise. We're trying to get through a couple more. Next one was, do you feel parents can speak too much about their child's life story? Is there too much? Is that?
Well, to other people, I think, I think it is the child's story, isn't it? So I worry sometimes if I hear adopters talking a lot to other people about the child's birth story. I think it is their story to share as and when they want to.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's very hard to get the balance right. I think it's all a bit of a gamble, isn't it? You never know till it's like anything when you're bringing up children. You never quite know if you've got it right till way down the line.
No, I call it reactive parenting with my own. It's that thing where I'm learning from them daily, but it it is that kind of openness, and I kind of am. So I'm putting myself in the child's shoes there, and I'm just thinking, if my parents were kind of talking about me as being adopted, I don't know how comfortable possibly I'd feel in certain contexts. I think. I have to say, so things like school, comprehensive school, I really didn't get on with at all, and we're in a small community. So then it's that thing where I'd always worry, well, what if the bongo drums went? I know it's slightly different here, but it's that thing that sometimes I was quite private in that way about what I wanted to share.
Yeah. Okay. What are your thoughts about changing a child's Christian name when they're adopted? Having been adopted yourselves?
I think I think it would be better to keep the same one if you can. I mean, I was Annette and then I became Anne, so in a way it felt like a shortening. I don't think that's why they did it, actually. I think they just liked the name Anne, but it does give, it's that continuity thing, isn't it? If I'd been born Carol and then called Anne, I think that would have felt a bit less continuous, a bit less of a continuous story than Anne, Annette, and then Anne. I don't know. How does it feel for you, Anne?
It's a really good question. I've kind of gone off into my normal. I do that now and again. I go into a fog when I'm into. Okay. Because I was Nicola. I don't know about Nicola. but on saying that, when I first met my birth mum, for a few years she'd call me Nicola. Because I was her Nicola.
Well, that's a good reason, just for trying to keep it as similar as possible, unless it's some really obscure name that's going to make that child very visible on social media, in which case I would definitely change it.
Yeah, I was thinking that in the instance where you're trying to kind of protect identity, and for those reasons, absolutely, that's different, as you're saying. But otherwise, I think it's a really good question, and I honestly am on the fence a little bit, because would I, if I had a choice going back to 1971, would I have changed my name? I'm going to sleep on that tonight. I'm probably wake up at 3 a.m. going, oh my god, I'm not Nicola.
Well, I think as well, nowadays in adoption, it's usually unlikely that you're given the option of changing a Christian name if the child adopted, unless there's a specific reason that for safeguarding, it needs to be changed or what have you, isn't it? I think unless they're very young. At the point
It
of
depends on the
adoption.
age as well, isn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, okay. You both mentioned becoming very curious at around 12 to 14 years. Nowadays, children of that age can search straight away on social media, as we were talking about earlier. Would you have done that, given the opportunity, if you were in that situation?
Yes,
You would
Yeah.
have.
absolutely. I wouldn't have been able to stop myself.
Yeah,
I
which
was
is
gonna
really good, really
say,
interesting to hear, isn't it? That temptation is so great. That need, not temptation, that need for
Mm.
information is so great.
And I
Yeah.
think your real impulse control at that age isn't brilliant, is it? Well,
No.
No,
mostly.
exactly.
No, I literally, I'm not joking, I had the telephone directory and I'd kind of rifle through the pages because I'd quite an unusual surname as well. And and there was only a handful of them in Cardiff. I thought, right, okay, I'll ring. So when my parents were out, and that the odd stage where you kind of, oh, right, I'm just gonna. I had all of God, I had a story lined up about every scenario. But yeah, nowadays, that's why I think it's almost talk about it maybe before they get to 13.
Absolutely. I think you have to. Yeah.
Because they will search because curiosity is really, really strong, and it's almost trying to talk about it before.
They're probably less likely to, I think, if you sort of make it clear that you kind of expect them to. They're probably then more likely to think, oh, I'm not going to do it if she expects me to.
Yeah.
It's your rebellious streak.
This person said, I'm afraid that in the future my children will feel resentment that I didn't give birth to them. Is anger a feeling that you dealt with as a young person towards your adoptive parents?
No, it never occurred to me.
No. If anything, I was complete opposite side to that. I was just so grateful. I think very grateful. I felt lucky. I felt in a way that I was wanting to shield them. Never anger, never ever anger at my parents, anger at my birth parents. Oh hell yeah, I'd all vivid situations of what they were like. And when I was told the situation, you're telling lies, but never anger. Not for adoption reasons anyway. Yes, of course, when I was a teenager, normal reasons.
Yeah.
Not letting me go out after 10 and all of that, having to do my homework, but nothing to do with adoption, no.
Okay. This is a good question about the stages of releasing certain aspects of the life journey book is something that this person thinks about a lot. Is there any help from agencies, social workers, etc., to gauge when to disclose certain bits of information? Any thoughts on that?
You mean the difficult stuff, I suppose?
I suppose you have to gauge it by where the child is with that kind of part of their journey in the individual case, don't you, really?
I would really recommend looking at and maybe I'll try and dig out a link that you can put somewhere, but Helen Oakwater does a really good thing about life journey work, and she describes how you can give sort of global descriptions of things when they're young and then nuance it a bit more, so you're never actually lying, but you're not being graphic when they're very young.
Yeah, definitely.
I always try and I struggle a little bit sometimes with trying to say the definition of age appropriateness, because it can be quite a wide bracket according to where the development of each child is. I know with our own that they're all so different, and even at the point of, say, their 5th birthday, they'd be completely different in character. One would be more advanced, one would be more curious, one would be more, and it's that thing of trying to gauge when the right time is to share information. I don't know necessarily, it's brilliant to kind of have a rough guide, but I don't know if there's a specific, how to one size fits all. I don't think.
No. And I think we have done a webinar around some life story work type things, but it might be something that we look at doing a more detailed webinar on, life story work and how to approach it and what kind of information to release when, or how to gauge it and that kind of thing, because
I'm sure I've seen some books. I'm sure we've got some good stuff in the AUK library about
well,
sharing difficult information. The helpline would be able to help people find the right books.
So maybe as a follow-up to this, there's a couple of other questions around life story, information and work, because when when we release the video from tonight's webinar on the page on the website, we can put some links to other bits and pieces in, and include like the link to the helpline, which is also on the website and stuff like that as well. So yeah, we'll do that, and if you think of anything else in between, you can always send it across. But I think what we'll do is we'll leave it there, because I'm conscious of time, and there's been quite a few questions, but hopefully we've kind of answered the majority of them adequately. And if we haven't got to your question, then I apologize, but I don't want to keep everyone too much later, because you know, it's nearly bedtime, isn't it? So, but there's been some lovely comments, lots of people saying thank you very much for sharing your stories and how useful it's been, Anne and Anne, so thank you very much. We are really grateful. I know that everyone that's been watching this evening has found it very useful and really informative, and lots to think about as adoptive parents, in how we kind of work with our young people and support them with all of these different challenges. So thank you very much. Like I said,
thank you as well for inviting. Honestly, it's such a privilege, and I just think you're all brilliant. So, you know, just
oh, well, no, you've been brilliant, and thank you very much again for giving your time, both of you. And no doubt we'll see you again on another webinar at some point in the future, hopefully.
No doubt.
pleasure.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for
Take
coming.
care, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night. Good
Bye.
evening.